The last showing, Jake had always thought working at a movie theater would be an easy job. He had been hired a few months ago, and most of his shifts were quiet, selling tickets, sweeping popcorn off the floor, and making sure people didn't sneak into movies without paying. That was about as exciting as it got. But tonight was different. Tonight, Jake was alone on the night shift. The other employees had left hours ago, and the last showings had ended. He was just about to lock up when something strange happened. The projector in Theater 6 turned on by itself. A black and white film started playing on the big screen. At first, Jake thought maybe someone had left the system running, but when he checked the schedule, he saw that no old movies were programmed that night. Curious, he walked down the long, empty hallway toward Theater 6. The flickering light from the projector spilled into the hallway, casting long shadows. As he stepped inside, the sound of crackling film filled the room. The movie was an old, grainy picture. The screen showed a dimly lit street, a woman walking alone. Something about it unsettled him. He didn't recognize the film, and yet it felt oddly familiar. He looked around the theater. Every row of seats was empty. The air felt colder than in the rest of the building, sending a chill up his spine. Taking a deep breath, he climbed up to the projector booth and turned off the machine. The screen went dark, and the room was silent once more. Satisfied, he left the theater, shaking his head. Probably just a glitch, he muttered to himself. But as he reached the lobby, the projector turned on again. Jake froze. He could hear the hum of the machine and the soft crackling of film. Slowly, he turned back and peered into the theater. The movie was playing again. But this time, something was different. A shadowy figure sat in the back row. Jake's heart pounded. He hadn't seen anyone come in. The doors were locked, and no one else was supposed to be in the building. Thinking it might be a prank, he walked down the aisle toward the back row. "Hey," he called out. The theaters closed. The figure didn't move. Jake stepped closer. "You can't be here. You need to leave." Still, no response. Feeling uneasy, he reached for his flashlight and shined it toward the seat. The light passed right through the figure. Jake stumbled backward, his breath catching in his throat. He blinked, trying to make sense of what he had just seen. But when he looked again, the figure was gone. His hands shook as he turned off the projector once more and practically ran out of the theater. His mind raced. Maybe he was just tired. Maybe the shadows were playing tricks on him. But then, the security footage told a different story. After locking up, Jake went to the office and pulled up the surveillance cameras. He rewound the feed to the moment he had entered Theater 6. His stomach twisted as he watched himself walk down the aisle, flashlight in hand. He saw himself stop, call out, and then step closer to the back row. But there was no figure. The camera showed nothing but empty seats. Jake leaned in closer, his hands gripping the desk. He had seen someone. He was sure of it. And yet, the footage showed him talking to no one. He played it again and again. Each time, the same result. He was alone. A cold shiver ran through him. Was he losing his mind? Had he imagined it all? Just as he was about to shut off the feed, something in the corner of the screen caught his eye. He rewound the footage again and slowed it down. At the very last second, just before he left the theater, a dark shape flickered in the corner of the frame. It was only there for a split second, but he saw it. The shadowy figure. And this time, it was looking right at the camera. Jake slammed the laptop shut and pushed away from the desk, his heart hammering. He grabbed his coat and bolted for the door. not caring if he left the closing duties unfinished. He just needed to get out of there. As he locked up and stepped into the cold night air, he told himself he would quit the next day. Whatever had happened in Theater 6, he wanted no part of it. But as he walked to his car, he felt something watching him. Something unseen. Something waiting. And in the reflection of his car window, just for a moment, he saw the shadowy figure standing right behind him. The man in the aisle. Mia had always loved horror movies. Ever since she was a kid, she enjoyed the thrill of getting scared, the tension of a creepy scene, and the excitement of a well-timed jump scare. It gave her an adrenaline rush, and she loved every second of it. One Friday night, she decided to go watch a new horror movie that had just been released. Her friends were busy, so she went alone. It wasn't unusual for her to watch movies by herself. She actually enjoyed it sometimes. The quietness allowed her to focus on the story without distractions. The theater was half full, with people scattered around in different rows. Some were in groups, while others, like her, sat alone. The dim lights, the smell of buttered popcorn, and the soft whispers of people settling in made her feel at home. The movie started, and Mia was completely absorbed in it. The eerie background music, the tense moments leading to scares, it was perfect. But about halfway through the film, she noticed something strange. A man was standing in the aisle. At first, she didn't think much of it. Maybe he was a staff member checking on the audience. Or maybe he was just stretching his legs. But then, she realized something odd. He wasn't looking at the screen. He was watching the audience. His posture was stiff, his head slightly tilted, and his eyes scanned the people as if he was looking for someone. Mia shifted in her seat, feeling a bit uneasy. The movie was still playing, but she couldn't focus anymore. Something about that man made her uncomfortable. Why would someone just stand there, staring at others instead of watching the movie? Then, he moved. Slowly, he stepped forward, moving closer to the seats. He wasn't walking normally. His steps were deliberate, almost calculated. He would pause, stand still for a moment, and then take another step. Mia felt her heartbeat quicken. She glanced around to see if anyone else had noticed, but everyone was focused on the movie. No one seemed to care. She looked back at the aisle. The man was gone. A chill ran down her spine. She quickly turned in her seat, scanning the rows behind her. Nothing. Had she imagined it? Trying to shake off the uneasiness, she turned her attention back to the movie. But the feeling of being watched lingered. It was as if someone was standing right behind her, breathing down her neck. When the movie finally ended, Mia let out a sigh of relief. She grabbed her things and headed toward the exit. But as she walked out, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following her. The hairs on her arms stood on end. Just to be safe, she stopped by the front desk and told one of the employees about the man in the aisle. Maybe he had snuck into the theater without a ticket. The employee frowned. "Are you sure? We didn't have anyone standing in the aisle." Mia nodded. "I saw him. He was staring at the audience and moving closer to the seats. It was really weird." The employee hesitated, then said, "Let me check the security footage." Mia waited as the employee pulled up the video from the theater's cameras. She expected to see the man standing in the aisle, proving that she wasn't imagining things. But what she saw made her stomach drop. The footage showed the audience watching the movie, but there was no man in the aisle. No one had been standing there. Maya's mouth went dry. "That's not possible," she whispered. "I saw him. He was there." The employee gave her a concerned look. "There's nothing on the video." But he hesitated, rewinding the footage to a different angle. Look at this. Mia leaned in, her heart pounding. The camera now showed a clear shot of her seat, and right next to her, where no one should have been, was a dark, shadowy figure. It didn't have a clear shape, but it was definitely there. It hovered beside her seat, almost blending into the darkness. Mia stepped back, her breathing uneven. What? What is that? The employee looked just as unsettled. I don't know. Maya's hands trembled as she picked up her bag. She needed to get out of there. Fast. As she walked home, she kept glancing over her shoulder. Every shadow, every flickering streetlight, every passing car made her jump. That night, as she lay in bed, she couldn't stop thinking about what she had seen. The man in the aisle, the missing footage, the shadow next to her seat. Had she imagined it all? Or had something been watching her the whole time? She never went to the theater alone again. The forgotten room. Alex and his friends loved exploring abandoned places. There was something thrilling about walking into forgotten buildings, imagining the stories they held. That's why, when they heard about the old Grandview Theater, they couldn't resist. The theater had been closed for over 40 years. Some people said it was haunted. Others said it was just too old and unsafe. But Alex, Jake, Emily, and Sarah didn't believe in ghosts. They believed in adventure. One evening, just before sunset, they gathered outside the rusty doors of Grandview Theater. The air smelled of dust and old wood. The building loomed over them, its once bright sign faded and covered in grime. The windows were boarded up, and the entrance was chained shut. But Alex had done his research. He knew about a broken window in the back, just big enough for them to squeeze through. Are you sure about this? Sarah asked, hugging her arms. Come on, Sarah. It'll be fun. Jake grinned. It's just an empty theater. Emily nodded. Besides, if anything happens, well, just run back out. Alex led the way, carefully pushing open the loose board covering the broken window. One by one, they climbed inside. The moment their feet hit the dusty floor, a cold chill passed through them. It was much colder inside than outside. The lobby was frozen in time. The ticket booth still had an old cash register. A torn movie poster hung on the wall, its colors faded. A few empty popcorn bags littered the floor, as if the last customers had just left. Creepy, Emily whispered, looking around. Jake ran a finger over the counter, showing the thick layer of dust. No one's been here in ages. They moved further inside, their footsteps echoing through the silent theater. The main screening room was massive, with rows of red velvet seats covered in dust. The huge movie screen at the front had a long tear down the middle. The air smelled musty, like old books and forgotten memories. This place must have been amazing when it was open, Sarah said, looking up at the ceiling, where a beautiful chandelier still hung, covered in cobwebs. Alex pulled out his flashlight. Let's look around. They split up, walking between the rows of seats. Every step kicked up little clouds of dust. As Alex ran his hand along one of the chairs, he noticed something strange. It felt warm. That's weird, he muttered. What? Emily asked, stepping beside him. This chair. It's warm, like someone was just sitting here. Emily frowned. Maybe the sun warmed it up? Alex nodded, though the idea didn't feel right. There was no sunlight inside. Just then, Sarah let out a small gasp. Did you hear that? They all stopped moving. Silence. Then, from somewhere in the darkness, came a faint whisper. Jake laughed nervously. Okay, that's creepy. Maybe it's the wind. Emily said, though she didn't sound convinced. Alex turned toward the projector room at the back of the theater. Let's check up there. They climbed the narrow staircase to the small, glass-windowed room where the projectionist would have worked. Dust-covered film reels were stacked against the walls. A large, rusty projector stood in the center, untouched for years. Suddenly, a loud clearance echoed through the room. The projector turned on by itself. A beam of light shot through the dusty air, illuminating the torn movie screen. Static crackled as an old black and white film began to play. The images were faded and shaky. People in elegant clothes, laughing and talking. "This isn't possible," Alex whispered. "There's no electricity." Emily grabbed his arm. "We need to go. Now." But before they could move, the temperature dropped even more. Their breath came out in white puffs. The whispers returned, growing louder, filling the room like a rising wind. The old film flickered, and suddenly, the seats below weren't empty anymore. Dozens of ghostly figures now sat in the chairs. They were dressed in 1940s clothing, women in elegant dresses, men in suits and hats. Their faces were pale and distant, as if they weren't really there. Some of them turned toward the group, their hollow eyes watching. The exit door slammed shut. Sarah screamed. Jake grabbed the handle and pulled, but it wouldn't budge. "It's locked." Emily backed away, her hands shaking. "What do we do?" The film continued playing. The figures in the seats moved their lips, whispering words the group couldn't understand. Then, the images on the screen changed. Instead of the movie, they now saw themselves. The four of them, standing in the projection room, looking terrified. Alex's stomach twisted. This isn't real. It can't be real. One of the ghostly figures, an old man with sunken eyes, slowly stood up. He lifted a pale hand and pointed directly at them. The whispers became voices. "Join us. Stay. Forever." A force pulled at them, an invisible weight pressing down, making it hard to breathe. Sarah fell to her knees, gasping. "Help me." Alex grabbed her arm, yanking her up. "We have to get out of here." Jake looked around frantically. There has to be another way. Emily's eyes landed on the torn movie screen. The screen! The back door. Without hesitation, they ran down the aisle, pushing past the cold, ghostly air. The spirits reached out, their fingers brushing against the group's arms, sending icy chills through their skin. Alex reached the screen first and yanked at the fabric. Behind it was a narrow doorway leading to the back alley. "This way," he shouted. One by one, they scrambled through, Sarah sobbing as she ran. The moment the last of them made it outside, the heavy door behind them slammed shut with a deafening bang. They collapsed onto the pavement, panting, their bodies trembling. The air outside was warm again, filled with the normal sounds of the night. Jake was the first to speak. "What the hell was that?" "No idea," Alex said, wiping his face. "But we are never going back in there." They stood up, looking at the old building one last time. The neon sign, which hadn't worked in decades, flickered once. Then, the whispers faded, and the theater fell silent again. The projectionist cursed Ben had always loved movies. That was why he took the job at the old Grandview Theater. It wasn't a big, modern cinema with fancy reclining seats and giant screens. No, the Grandview was small, old-fashioned, and a little worn down. It smelled of popcorn, dust, and something else. Something Ben couldn't quite place but had been there for decades. Some nights, when he walked through the empty halls, he swore he heard whispers, but he told himself it was just the wind slipping through the cracks. The job was easy enough. Ben spent most nights in the projection booth, playing old films for the handful of people who still came to watch movies at the Grand View. He liked the quiet. It was just him, the hum of the projector, and the flickering light dancing on the screen below. But one night, something changed. While cleaning the back room of the projection booth, Ben found a locked cabinet. It was old and rusted, with a heavy padlock hanging from the handle. He had never noticed it before. Curious, he searched the room until he found a set of old keys in a dusty drawer. Most didn't fit, but after some fumbling, one finally clicked. The cabinet door creaked open. Inside, there was only one thing: a film reel. It was unlabeled, its canister covered in dust. Ben lifted it out, examining it under the dim light. There was nothing to say what movie it was or why it had been locked away. Feeling a strange excitement, Ben decided to play it. He threaded the film into the projector and switched it on. The screen in the theater flickered to life, but what played was not a normal movie. The images were distorted, the film grainy and scratched. At first, it was just black and white shadows shifting across the screen. Then, shapes began to form. People, their faces twisted in horror. Their mouths were open in silent screams, their eyes wide with terror. But there was no sound, just the mechanical whirring of the projector. Ben felt his stomach tighten. Something about the film made his skin crawl. It felt wrong. The longer he watched, the more uneasy he became. The people on the screen weren't acting. Their fear looked real. He could almost feel it. Then, the film cut to black. The reel spun empty, its film flapping uselessly against the machine. Shaken, Ben turned off the projector and took the reel out. He placed it back in the cabinet and locked the door. Maybe it was just an old experimental film, something forgotten over time. That was what he told himself as he left the theater that night. But the next evening, when Ben returned to work, something was different. As he stepped into the projection booth, he noticed deep scratches on the glass window that looked down into the theater. They hadn't been there before. The marks were jagged, as if something had clawed at the glass from the inside. His hands trembled as he reached out to touch them. The night went on, and Ben tried to ignore the uneasy feeling growing in his chest. But then he saw them. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. In the dim theater, just beyond the flickering light of the screen, dark figures stood among the empty seats. Their outlines were barely visible, but their mouths were wide open, frozen in silent screams. Just like the people from the film. Ben's breath caught in his throat. He blinked, and they were gone. Heart pounding, he grabbed the keys and ran to the locked cabinet. He needed to destroy the film. But when he threw the door open, the reel was missing. Then, from the projection booth, the projector flickered to life on its own. The screen glowed as the film began to play again. Ben stumbled backward. He hadn't touched the projector. His hands were shaking too much to even try. But there it was, rolling on its own, showing the same horrifying images, the same screaming faces. He turned and ran. That night, Ben couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying what had happened over and over again. He told himself he must have imagined it. Maybe he had been overworked. Maybe he was just seeing things. But the next night, the reel was back in the cabinet, as if he had never removed it at all. And at midnight, the projector turned itself on again. This time, Ben stayed to watch. He stood frozen as the figures from the film began to appear once more. But now, they were closer. They stood in the aisles, staring up at him with their hollow, gaping mouths. He wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but stand there. But his feet wouldn't move. Then, the lights in the theater flickered. The screen went dark. And in the silence, he heard it. A whisper, right behind him. Ben spun around, but there was no one there. Just the empty projection booth. Just the silent, humming machine. The next morning, he tried to tell his boss about the film, but the old man just laughed and shook his head. "There's no locked cabinet in the booth, kid." Ben's blood turned cold. He ran upstairs, back to the projection room, back to where he had seen the cabinet with his own eyes. But when he got there, the wall was bare. The cabinet was gone. But the projector? It was already running. The mysterious ticket collector in a small, quiet town. There stood an old movie theater named Grand Oaks Cinemas. It had been around for decades, serving as a beloved spot where families, couples, and friends gathered to watch films. The theater had an old-fashioned charm, with velvet curtains, golden framed mirrors, and an enormous chandelier that hung in the lobby. Over the years, however, fewer people visited, and the cinema became more of a relic than a lively attraction. The locals often spoke about a strange tale, the mystery of the missing ticket collector. It was said that many years ago, a dedicated worker named William had vanished without a trace. He had been working one stormy evening, just like any other night, when he disappeared. No one saw him leave, and he was never found. Some believed he had run away, while others whispered about something more eerie. Regardless, his story became a local legend, passed down through generations. A new employee, Ella, was new in town. She had recently moved from a bustling city, hoping to find some peace in the slower pace of life. She loved books, old movies, and anything with a bit of history. So when she saw a job posting for an evening shift at Grand Oaks Cinemas, she applied right away. The manager, Mr. Harris, was an older gentleman who had worked at the theater for decades. He was kind but serious, and he had a habit of avoiding questions about the past. "It's an easy job," he told Ella on her first day. "Just sell tickets, clean up, and lock the doors at the end of the night. If you hear any strange stories about this place, don't pay them any mind." Ella laughed nervously. "What kind of stories?" Mr. Harris waved his hand dismissively. "Ghost stories. Just small-town nonsense." That night, as Ella worked the ticket booth, she noticed that the theater felt different. The chandeliers flickered, and sometimes she thought she heard faint whispers. But when she turned around, no one was there. The place had an unsettling silence when empty, like it was holding secrets of its own. An unusual encounter one particularly stormy night. Ella was closing up. Rain poured heavily outside, and the wind howled against the old theater walls. As she was locking the front doors, she noticed a figure standing outside, just beyond the entrance. It was an elderly man wearing a faded uniform, a ticket collector's uniform. She hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward. "I'm sorry, sir. The theater is closed for the night." The man simply smiled and extended his hand. In his fingers, he held a torn movie ticket. Ella reached out and took it, glancing down at the faded text. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw the date printed on it, 50 years ago. A chill ran down her spine, and she quickly looked up, but the man was gone. The street was empty, and the only sound was the rain tapping against the pavement. Ella's breath quickened. Had she imagined it? Was it just a prank? She hurried back inside, locking the doors behind her, her hands trembling. The investigation begins the next morning. Ella arrived early to speak with Mr. Harris. Mr. Harris, did we have any elderly employees still working here? Maybe someone who used to work here years ago? She asked cautiously. Mr. Harris frowned. No, why? Ella hesitated. I saw an old man in a uniform last night. He handed me this ticket. She placed the old, crumpled ticket on the counter. The date on it says 1973. Mr. Harris' face went pale. He picked up the ticket, inspecting it closely. After a moment, he exhaled deeply and said, Where did you get this? Ella explained everything. Mr. Harris remained silent for a long time before walking toward the office. He gestured for her to follow. Inside, there was a wall of old photos of past employees. He pointed to a picture in the middle. Is this the man you saw? He asked. Ella's stomach dropped. The man in the photo was the same one she had seen the night before. That's William, Mr. Harris said. The ticket collector who vanished in 1973. Ella felt a shiver down her spine. But how? That's impossible. Mr. Harris sat down. No one ever figured out what happened to him. He was working here one night, and then he was just gone. Some say he still lingers here, waiting for something. Maybe he's trying to finish his last shift, unraveling the truth, determined to learn more. Ella visited the town's library and searched old newspaper archives. She found articles about William's disappearance, how he had been seen at the theater that night, but never again. Police searched for weeks, but no trace of him was ever found. One article mentioned something peculiar. A customer had claimed they saw William talking to a stranger just before he disappeared. The stranger was described as tall, wearing a long coat, and had an odd presence about him. The police never identified this person, and the case went cold. Ella also found reports from other theater employees over the years. Stories of strange occurrences, whispers in the empty lobby, and shadows moving in the dark. Everyone who worked at the theater had a story, but no one ever connected them to William. The second encounter, Ella decided to stay late the following night, determined to see William again. The theater was empty, except for the soft hum of an old projector still running. Midnight approached, and just as she was about to give up, she heard footsteps in the lobby. She turned slowly, and there he was. William stood near the ticket booth, holding another torn ticket. This time, Ella didn't run. Instead, she stepped closer. William? She whispered. The old man's eyes met hers. He smiled, just as he had before, and held out the ticket. Ella hesitated, then took it. This time, she didn't look away. What do you need? She asked. For a brief moment, the lights flickered, and a soft voice echoed through the room. Home, he whispered. Ella's heart pounded. Home? What did he mean? Before she could ask, a gust of wind swept through the lobby, and William disappeared once more. A final farewell the next day. Ella searched through old records and discovered something shocking. William's family had moved away shortly after his disappearance, never knowing what had happened to him. She found an address for his last living relative, a niece who lived in the next town over. Ella reached out and told her what she had found. The woman, now elderly herself, broke into tears. We never got to say goodbye. We always wondered if he had just left us. With permission, Ella arranged a small memorial for William at the theater. That night, as she stood in the empty lobby, she felt a presence. Calm, peaceful. She whispered, You can go home now. The lights flickered one last time, and then all was still. From that night on, the whispers stopped, and the shadows no longer moved in the dark corners of Grand Oak Cinema. William's shift had finally ended,